Hello and welcome to week 3 of our Lenten small group study on spiritual micro-practices. Before we begin today, I would encourage you to share among others in your group what your experience was last week practicing simplicity. What was that like for you? What did you learn about attentiveness last week as you practiced simplicity? All right, now let's begin this week with our usual get to know you question. This week's question is this: what is your favorite book? What's your favorite book? When did you first read it? And why is it your favorite? This week's spiritual micro-practice is the practice of reading Scripture repetitively. Reading Scripture repetitively. Now, usually when we sit down to read something, we set out to read it as quickly as possible. We read it greedily, trying to soak up as much information as we can from whatever it is we're reading. Whether it's an exciting novel that we're quickly reading through because we're so suspenseful about what's going to happen next, or if it's a nonfiction piece and we're trying to learn information about a certain discipline. Typically when we read as quickly as we can. Now, the Bible is a big book. And so sometimes we import that same reading strategy from all the other ways we read into our reading of Scripture. Maybe we sit down to read and we think, well, what should I read? Something from the Old Testament? Something from the Psalms? Something from the Gospels? Something from Paul's letters? And pretty soon we've got so much we want to read that we are flying through the text. Sometimes in our enthusiasm to read as much of the Bible as we can, we bite off more than we can chew. Now, it's certainly true that when we read the Bible, we want to absorb what we're reading. We want to remember it. But the primary purpose of reading the Bible is not to absorb information. It's to hear God's voice. The primary purpose of our reading Scripture is to hear God speak. And sometimes we might assume that the more we read, the more God will speak, but that's not necessarily true. Sometimes the slower we read, the more deliberately we read, the clearer God's voice begins to come into our minds and our hearts. So today I'd like to introduce to you an ancient practice of reading Scripture called Lectio Divina, or sacred reading. The sacred reading is a way of reading Scripture that intentionally listens for the voice of God, and it requires reading the same passage multiple times. There's many different ways to practice the sacred reading, but today I'll introduce to you what has been helpful in my own experience, and you can adapt it according to what's most useful to you. To begin, find a quiet place and select a passage of Scripture that's not too short, but also not too long. 10 to 15 verses is usually good. And you're going to read this same text 3 different times. First, read the text quietly to yourself. Listen for which words jump out at you, leave an impression on you, linger with you, and keep those words at the forefront of your mind to see if they continue to take shape in the next 2 readings. Second, read the text out loud to yourself. This may seem strange at first, but reading it out loud brings another of our 5 senses into reading, so that we're not just seeing the text, but we're also hearing it. And finally, read the text a 3rd time, but this time, copy it down, write it out on a sheet of paper as you read it. This technique will help you to linger on the text, to consider certain words as they take shape beneath your pen or pencil, and it gives you another view to approach this same text. All throughout these 3 readings, read slowly and carefully, savoring each word of the text, allowing each word to get beneath the surface, to provoke certain recollections or associations in your mind. This allows the text to speak directly to your life and your experiences, which is ultimately the purpose of our reading the text. It's allow God to speak God's truth into our lives. Finally, it may be helpful to keep a journal of the insights that we gain from our spiritual readings. We don't need to journal a long time. Certainly, our journal entry doesn't need to be any longer than the text itself. But if there's a couple of insights that you gain about yourself or about the text, it could be helpful to jot those down in 1 or 2 sentences so that you can return to them over time and realize just how much God has said to you, just how many things God has spoken to you as you practice sacred reading. Now, as we consider this practice of sacred reading more in our groups, we have a number of discussion questions for you to consider. The first question is, have you had experience with this kind of practice in some way before? And if so, what did you think about that experience? How has your experience reading the Bible been different from your experience reading other books? Is it more intellectually and spiritually challenging to read familiar or unfamiliar passages from the Bible? Finally, our last question is this. What might get in the way of you making time for this practice in the upcoming week? How might you plan accordingly and set yourself up for success with this practice?